Imagine a world where every home and village has its own clean source of electrical energy, free from the cost of fossil fuels, nuclear power, or a centralized electric grid. Imagine every means of transportation running off of clean power plants using no source of fuel and creating no pollution. Imagine a world blossoming with these new technologies and the rainforest protected from slash and burn, farming and logging industries changed and transformed. I'm talking today to two very, very special people from the Orion Project, which was founded by Dr. Stephen Greer, which is an organization created to transform the current energy, environmental, and social crisis into a world of sustainability and enlightened abundance. They focus on technological processes in the areas of advanced physics and electromagnetic systems, and if appropriately supported, will enable humanity to live on the Earth with a minimal footprint with genuine long-term sustainability. My guests today are Dr. Ted Loder and Dr. Jan Bravo. Dr. Ted Loder retired in May of 2005 as a professor from the University of New Hampshire, where he specialized in the Department of Earth Sciences and the Institute for the Study of Earth, Oceans, and Space. Dr. Jan Bravo is a physician with specialty training and board certification in emergency medicine, and she's been practicing physician for 20 years, and she has a special interest in developing new energy technologies as they can be adapted to the delivery of healthcare. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you very much, Hillary.
Well, I'm very excited about this show, and I've been looking forward to speaking with you, both of you. And I'd like to start to see if both of you would like to share briefly how your own personal paths have found its way to this topic of extraterrestrials, alien reversed engineered technology, and the Orion Project. Dr. Loder, why don't we start with you?
Great, thank you very much. As a teenager and child and teenager, I was very interested in the UFO issue. Although at that time, there's nothing I could do about it as just a kid back in the 50s. It wasn't until about 12, 13 years ago that my cousin, now deceased, Brigadier General Stephen Lufkin, who worked in the White House under Eisenhower and was involved heavily in the whole UFO issue with President Eisenhower, told me about the reality of these issues. And from that point, I met Dr. Greer and started being involved in the UFO issue. But what I realized along the way very rapidly was that one of the major reasons for keeping the UFO issue secret was that the technologies which it represented, if you will, and that included the anti-gravity or counter-gravity technologies as well as energy technologies. And I realized that one of the reasons that's kept secret, the UFO issue is kept secret, because once people realize that these technologies exist or already in extant, that they would say, hey, why can't we do it? And so that drove me into the more and more into the energy issue field, and that's where I've been working ever since with Dr. Greer and Dr. Bravo and others.
And I want to mention to those that are listening, you can go to the orionproject.org and you can find out more information about both of my guests today and their passions and their projects and what they're working on, where you can also find some incredible articles, and you may also find them on my Facebook page as well. I'll be posting them along the way. Dr. Bravo, can you share your experiences and how your own personal path came to find its way to this topic?
Certainly. It was about 12 years ago that I first went to one of Dr. Greer's conferences, and it was having to do with UFOs and that entire issue, and I learned a great deal, some of which Dr. Loder has already mentioned. The most important thing is that I've watched over the last 12 years, Hillary, and I think everyone can attest to the fact that the world energy situation has become particularly critical. And as that has built up, we realized that we needed to do something. There's lots of talk, and a lot of people are doing a lot of things to try to get clean, sustainable sources of energy to the world. But we know that there are some particularly important types of energy and energy devices that have been developed really since Tesla in the early 20th century, and that need to be investigated, expanded, reproduced, and brought out to help the world. So that's really brought me to this point.
That's your passion. Well, do you believe that these technologies are out in the world now, that we actually are using them on some level, but maybe just not for the benefit of humanity, Jan?
Yes, I do. We have information. Dr. Greer is an expert on this. He has many sources, direct sources of information from the intelligence community, and in classified projects, these devices have been made and used, and in fact, we know some scientists who have both developed them and worked on them and used them.
Mm-hmm. Ted, what are your thoughts on that?
I'll certainly support Jan's comments on that. An example of this, which is pretty much proven if you look at the literature, is the anti-gravity, a so-called anti-gravity issue. And a number of people, including myself, have written papers or even books on this subject. And in the mid-50s, practically every airline or airplane manufacturer was involved in anti-gravity research, and suddenly the whole thing went silent. That's the mid-50s. And we know from military witnesses that by the late 50s, early 60s, we had developed our own anti-gravity technologies, crude at that point, but nevertheless developed our own. And that's the late 50s, early 60s, and it's now 50 years later. And the amount of money that's going into that is horrific, and it's well known in a lot of circles that we already have these technologies. And wouldn't it be a far better world, if you will, if we were using non-polluting technologies that would mean that we wouldn't be running Boeings or Airbuses around the sky, burning incredible amounts of fossil fuel, and that we used other technologies that are much more advanced, much safer, and non-polluting. So this is one of the goals that we see. And I wrote a paper that's on our website about these issues, and coupled it with the witnesses from the Disclosure Project to say, look, here's what we see what's happening historically. Here's what the witnesses were telling us. Here's what science is telling us today, and sort of put those three pieces together of a three-legged stool to indicate that we have these technologies, but they're sequestered and they aren't available to normal people.
My first thought, and I've been asked this question by listeners, the ordinary, average, everyday person who gets into this topic, the UFO subculture, as you both know, is littered with so much information, and so much of it is disinformation. It's very difficult to navigate through the topic and try to find some sense of honest science. How do you suggest people who really want to get into this and want to know more about it navigate these subcultures? Ted, let's start with you.
I was going to say, well, one place to start is reading the OrionProject.org. That's one word, the OrionProject.org website. And we have some papers on there by various people, including Dr. Tom Bearden and myself and a number of other people about these technologies. And so if people start reading this, and some of it's complicated, some of it's easy to read, they'll start to put together the sense that, oh my gosh, there are alternative ways of looking and at energy and of producing energy that are not being addressed by our present government and our present scientists. And once that sinks into people, then they start to realize that there may be a better way to do things, and that is sort of that critical threshold in understanding. So that's a good place to start. And there's Sterling Allen's website on the web, dealing with energy, pure energy system news, for example. He has a wide network of energy inventors, and then posts what's going on. There are literally hundreds of inventors around the world working on various technologies but most of them, for most people, it's done on a shoestring, and they're in their garage, literally in their garage in many cases. And what we want to do is set up a program with the Orion Project where we actually put together a laboratory with the proper security and this group of scientists, physicists, and scientists who can actually take some of the best technologies that people are aware of and actually do a scientific proper development of these technologies, because we know they exist.
Yeah, and Jan, before we get your thoughts on that question, I kind of want to go into another topic quickly. Is do you believe that these technologies are being weaponized to be used for revolutionizing warfare?
Do I?
Yeah, Ted, sorry.
Well, yes, certainly some of them producing, I mean, warfare requires energy, so producing energy can be used and weaponized, but it's gone way beyond scalar interferometry technologies, scalar technology, weapon technology, psychotronic technologies are technologies that have been weaponized and used by covert military programs. But, you know, so are AK-47s. So I think one of the arguments people have put forth is that, well, we don't want to develop these technologies because they might be used for warfare. Well, they're already there, so but they aren't used by us. So it's a one-sided thing at this point, which is keeping us all
in the dark.
In the dark,
literally,
or beholding to the oil cartels.
Yeah, we're going to go back to this. We're going to go back to that topic. I do want to get Jan's viewpoints on how Jan, how would you suggest people, if somebody comes to you, say in one of the trainings, I know you work with Dr. Greer and you come to the CSETI trainings, and they really are confused about the information that they're finding in the subculture, in the ET UFO subculture. What would you suggest to somebody who isn't very well versed in all of the scientific background, but very interested in the contact process and is looking for information?
Well, that's a good question, Hillary. The first thing I would say is there's a lot of information, even without coming to a conference, on a website that is CSETI, that's the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, www.cseti.org. There's much information there, and that could be a good starting point, even before coming to a conference, where one can read. I will say that so much of what's out there, it's really an important point, and I'm glad you brought this up, is disinformation, but it's also very much fear-based. And I think that's the first thing that is a clue, that someone needs to look a little deeper to see if this is real. If you think about it, if we're talking about extraterrestrials that can travel through space faster than the speed of light with another physics. We went from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics and into quantum physics, and we continue on. Well, there's another step on the spectrum as we evolve. So there's more physics that we have yet to know, and I think it's very exciting. And if these individuals can travel faster than certainly we can, I think it's safe to assume that if they wanted to injure us or hurt us or eat us for dinner, that they could take care of that very quickly. Some people, I had someone tell me the other day, well, they want to come and take humans to eat, as a food source. And I thought, wow, that's pretty unevolved. And my goodness, it seems like it's going backwards in time rather than forward as far as a step in evolution. So my point being, I think if one feels a great deal of fear-mongering, us versus them, that's a sign to stop and really, really look carefully and think if this just makes sense from a common sense point of view. And again, I take you back to, there's a lot of information on the CSETI site that's just free and there for people to read and see, see what we know, see what we've found out. And so that would be my first thought. Just It is difficult with so much coming at people, but if it's an us versus them, and we're going to end up getting into a war, a space war, as Douglas MacArthur said, told the UN, the final, the Third World War will be fought in space. If we think we're going to get to that point, then it's going to be an unwinnable war for us. Because the other beings can come here. So I think we need to approach it with a more common sense point of view, and see how we can really understand what's going on and move forward.
And do you feel that a strong sense of groundedness is important for people as they navigate this topic?
Absolutely. That's a good point. Absolutely, Hillary. Yes.
Dr. Loder, I'd like to ask you to go maybe into some more in-depth explanation of the technology that you feel has been reverse engineered and put out into the industrial military complex, and what we're really looking at around the world as everyday items that we may be using that was perhaps taken from this technology. Would you like to share that with the listeners?
Sure. I think some of these ideas have come from. Well, let's step back a second, and back to the anti-gravity issue, although that's just one of the many. T. Townsend Brown in the late 20s had observed initially an anti-gravity effect using asymmetric capacitors and high voltages. That's in the late 20s. By the mid-1950s, he was demonstrating some of these technologies to the U.S. Navy in Hawaii. Now, simultaneously, or during the same time period, during the 40s, even before that, but certainly during the 40s, we shot down several ET craft. How many I'm not sure of, but Roswell was certainly one of the most well-known events. And there was technology on board those craft that was, according to Colonel Corso and others, was farmed out to various corporate America, RCA and others, to see what they could do with it. It is stated by Corso in his book, and as I said, other people, that the development of integrated circuits, fiber optics, lasers, and some other technologies came from the investigation of this foreign technology or ET technology. Now, there's a sort of a juxtaposition of U.S. or human development of technology, such as T. Townsend Brown developing things. So we were at a point in the 40s and 50s when we knew a lot, but seeing this other technology allowed us to make a major leap forward. I mean, if you think about it, the development of technology from the 40s to the present over a 60-year period, which is a 60, 70-year period, which is really a short piece of human history, has been incredible. Just incredible. And so that we were jump-started, if you will, by having some of this ET technology. Once you know something can be done, it's a heck of a lot easier to figure it out than it is not knowing something can be done. And there are multiple. So that's one comment about ET technology that we may have used. This has been proposed and suggested by several people, as I said, but I don't personally have any specific proof of that, although it certainly makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about nanotechnology, Ted? Do you feel that is has been built off of this reverse engineered technology?
There are certainly a number of reports of nanotechnology being used in some of the craft that have been shot down. Dr. Greer describes the testimony of a young soldier in South America who was told to guard a craft that had been shot down, and he described the part of the craft that was wounded or shot at, so to speak, was actually trying to repair itself, kind of like a wound in high speed. Repairing itself, and it's hypothesized by many that nanotechnology is used in at least some of the craft, so that their craft themselves are kind of a conscious living organism. At least some of them, certainly not all of them. Some are pretty nuts and boltsy, but some are very, very advanced technology. So yes, I don't know much more about the nanotechnology application. This is just what's been hypothesized. But
well, I find that the reason I ask that is because the military is the number one funder, the backing, financially into the research of nanotechnology, and it's been used to do a lot of militarizing of different aspects of warfare and stuff. So I wonder that because, basically they were the ones who helped to navigate through the whole disbursement of the reverse engineered technology in the first place when Roswell hit. Now, it's been known that aliens, the ETs, the extraterrestrial intelligent beings that have been visiting Earth have been marked in, and recorded in ancient cultures all the way back to the beginning, And I'm curious because a lot of people in this topic seem to talk about Roswell forward. And we don't often go backwards even further into indigenous cultures and their relationships with the star beings and their prophecies and stuff. And I'm curious for both of you and what your thoughts are on that connection to this phenomena, because they seem to have a really good relationship with the fact that the star beings are beautiful contributors to the entire life web, if you will. Jan, what are your thoughts? Do you have any comments on that?
Yes. There is actually a wealth of drawings, cave pictures, all sorts of paintings, actually, through time that show beings. But interestingly, the point you make is very important. They seem peaceful. There's nothing about weapons being shot down. The people are smiling. They're usually working together. They seem to be somehow in concert. I think that's a very important point. And it also goes back to the point, if these beings that can make it to our planet are warlike or want to take us over, they could have a way back. And that didn't happen. So I think that speaks to an important point to look at the history of that.
Mm-hmm. Ted, what are your thoughts?
I certainly agree with Jan. There's a massive amounts of evidence of our planet being visited literally throughout the ages by flying devices and what have you. It's just that the people very often mention Roswell because it's sort of the start, or that period, the mid-40s, is the start of the, quote, modern era of UFO contact, because, and it's hypothesized that that's when we set off the first nuclear devices on this planet. And up to that point, humans were basically throwing bigger and bigger rocks at each other. Now, they might have been rocket-propelled rocks, but nevertheless just throwing things at each other, bigger sticks, etc. At that point, we had crossed the threshold to a point where humans could actually destroy the planet. And so the ETs do not wish this to happen, but they also feel that humans have their own free will. There's free will in the universe, and the humans need to sort of get their own act together. As Dr. Greer often says, we really can't go into cosmic codependence on this issue. Humans have to solve the human problems. And so it was that period, sort of the beginning of the modern UFO era, when a tremendous number of sightings, matching, I might add, some of the craft that were drawn in caves and on rock drawings thousands of years ago. It's very interesting, isn't it?
It sure is, and my personal opinion on Roswell is it was the beginning era of our wanting to cause that war, that perception of danger and threat. And I think that the reason the military got involved is because they knew of this. And I'm curious if you have any comments on how the Germans were involved, and they were involved in a lot of esoteric research. They were involved in a lot of, I feel, similar research and scientific inquiry into this topic. And the fact that they came, or we offered them refuge after World War II, and I feel that we continued that research and technology. Do you have any things you'd like to share on that topic itself? Did they actually get the first craft, or do you have any insight on how they got it?
I don't know. I've just seen a lot of writings about it. Nick Cook, as you probably know, wrote a book a number of years ago called The Hunt for Zero Point, in which he sort of tried to document a lot of that material from the from the Nazi period in terms of their own work in these advanced technologies. I just don't. I haven't seen any solid evidence, but there certainly is a lot of rumors to that case, to that situation. So I don't really know. And remember, but on another comment on that, remember that the United States American rocket program, space program, et cetera, was really built on the backs of German scientists from World War II. Werner Braun, Obrecht, and a number of others during Project Paperclip. They were brought over to work with us, so they really played a major role in that. And they certainly had their experiences in the initial training in Germany under the Nazis, where they were essentially forced to work for the Nazis.
It is a really interesting topic for people who, and again, it's another, I call it a Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole that once you jump down and you kind of have to feel your way through it. My one personal love for this topic is the history of ceremony and the history of prayers and the history of the indigenous people working with the star beings in a ceremonial setting, in a sacred setting. And when I went to a CSETI training in September, Dr. Greer was doing pujas and this prayer ceremony, which, Jen, you were there, we participated in. And the energy that it produces just seems to draw them in. And I'm curious if you two have comments on what that higher spiritual element to the whole contact experience. Why is that so important? Jen, let's start with you.
Well, first of all, think about it. If you're inviting people to have contact with you, you can do it in a spirit of openness, welcoming, and peace, or you can bring some other sort of attitude. This is essentially what the puja does. It's a Sanskrit ceremony that's very ancient, and I think the fact that it's still around says something. It's welcoming and peace. As you found, and as you just said, it's a delightful ceremony that opens up warming, welcome consciousness. And interestingly, that's part of how we can communicate and contact the ETs, through this consciousness. They're obviously, it would seem, as all beings, drawn to peacefulness and welcoming. So I think it's important that you brought that up, and it's a wonderful way to make contact. And as you saw, it did.
Ted, what has been your experience with that spiritual element to this work?
Oh, I think it's been actually very good, and it is a part of the key to understanding the entire ET extraterrestrial phenomena. Is that they aren't going to, as Jan said earlier, they're not going to come here to eat us for lunch or make us mine gold or anything other silly thing like that. The technologies they have are at a point where they can produce through consciousness and the interface between consciousness and technology. They can produce what they need. They don't have to grow people in vats or anything. So this is just fear stuff developed to scare people. But there's a very high level of consciousness, spiritual consciousness, that are involved in with the ETs. Remember, as I think Schrodinger said, there's really only one mind in the universe, and we're all connected into it through consciousness. ETs who are conscious, and the humans who are conscious. We're just a little bit further back on the track in terms of utilizing this, or at least most people are, in terms of their daily functioning and whatever else. But that's because the travel, back to that comment again that Jan had made earlier, the travel between star systems and Earth systems, etc., is done through the application of the interface of consciousness and the machines or their craft that can take us here. And so they really sort of bridge that world between the 3D world that we all live in and the consciousness world that we all live in as well. And we're all connected, certainly with their communications are essentially instantaneous throughout the universe. You can't do that using radio waves and Motorola TVs and what have you.
Well, you know, when I share this message with people, the first most common thing that they say to me is, well, we can't even get along as human beings. You know, we still are kind of stuck in the Stone Age, if you will, of, you know, racism and even men and women not getting along. And, you know, we judge other cultures for their religious beliefs and the way that they run their countries. And so it seems like such a huge task to get the human species together to even acknowledge the fact that, you know, not only are we, you know, different in ways, but we're all one, but now we're not only the same as other cultures on other planets. It's almost overwhelming for most people to make that connection. And so, you know, and then when they start getting into the governments, you know, working it seems like they're working against us to help us do that. They get very, very overwhelmed with a sense of hopelessness. And so I'm curious, you know, what both of you would have to say to people that carry that or don't even want to get into these topics because it feels depressing or dark or negative in itself. There seems to be a lot of negative energy that's associated with this particular topic as a subculture because of all of the good versus bad stuff going on and people sharing different experiences and having all of these things happen to them that may not be, you know, necessarily they you know, translate as negative. And so I'm curious if you have any insight or personal opinions on, you know, what would it take for us to really just get along with each other before we can even get along with other species on other planets?
That is
whose comments do you want, Jan?
$64 million question.
I'm sorry.
Okay,
Jan, let's start with you.
One thing, let me go ahead. One thing I will say is that basically I'm an optimist. I think we can evolve to where we want to be. There are certain points in history. Think about the Second World War. Think about the Holocaust. Think about the civil rights movement in this country. There were times when there was such systematic suffering that it was unbelievable. And it's hard to believe that even happened, but we moved past it. Other problems step in and move in. But the point is, I see, just looking around, I see that we can evolve. And yes, we need to, before the weapons that we do have on this planet are used massively, that is the thermonuclear weapons and the scalar weapons. But there is hope, and I think one should look at all the good that's out there as well as the bad. And if one keeps somewhat of perspective, I think it's easier to put one foot in front of another and move forward.
Mm-hmm.
I've got
Ted,
a
what are your
couple.
thoughts?
May I pop in here?
Yes, please.
If we look at, let's see, where am I going with this? One of the main problems with the people in the world today is a combination of population. There are really too many people in the world to deal with things sustainably the way we are doing it. Doesn't mean we couldn't, but the way we are doing it. And that has to do with energy and resources. And it really flows back to energy. The quote, more civilized countries on this planet, or at least the countries where people have their needs met, they have food, clothing, and shelter, if you will, and a sense of security and safety. Those countries have various larger amounts of energy available to the peoples in those countries, because we need energy to do things. Everything from travel to raising food to dealing with environmental disposal of waste products, etc. So one of the things that we feel very strongly is that the development of expensive, or should we say cheap, or even, quote, free energy, it's not free because you have to build the way to get it, but at least the energy itself is free. By doing that and making those technologies available to both the first world and the third world and the second world, sort of brings the humans of all races and countries to more or less the same level in terms of their energy capabilities and energy availability at a cost that they can afford it. Once that happens, we start to reduce the reasons for stress which cause countries to go to war with each other. Typically, it's over resources or land or space. If you have a country that is mostly dry due to deforestation and overgrazing and over-agriculturing, not a good word, but you know what I mean, then people want, so they need more land. If you had the energy technologies to provide desalination and to provide water for that area, I'm thinking perhaps parts of Africa and Asia, then people could sustain themselves because they have the energy to produce what they need. And this reduces their stress. They don't have to go get to war with other people to get more land to do their thing. So there's a direct link between people going to war and their stress levels and energy that's actually available for them to carry out the living that they wish to do.
For those of you listening, you can go to theorionproject.org. You can see the information that we're talking about, share in the articles, and spread it across your networks. You can also find it on my radio homepage as well as my website, hillaryraimo.com. And for more information on the CSETI groups, you can go to CSETI.org, Jan, or is it .com?
.org.
CSETI.org, and those links are also on my website for those of you who'd like to check that out. Now, Ted, I'd like to ask you, now I see your vision when you're talking about this incredible opportunity that the human race has, but it's pretty well documented that weather modification technology is being used. China came out publicly and said that they used it for the opening day of the Olympics to ensure a bright, sunny day. How do we know that, these kinds of things would assist in that if there are technologies out there who are controlling that? Does that make sense? I'm just kind of wondering how would we know the difference between, when governments are playing with weather and trying to change it across the board. Do you have any insight into that technology or how that's being used or how we can overcome, the obvious abuses that would be pretty obvious?
Obviously abuses, but, people have been, societies have been trying to affect and control the weather ever since, I suppose, and before, Indian rain dances and cloud seeding with carbon dioxide, et cetera, using scalar technology and atmospheric heater technology and other technologies is just sort of another step, and Oregon shooters is just another step in terms of trying to control the weather. But there has to be an understanding of the real, true nature of weather and energy in order to make that happen. Obviously, multiple governments are working on these technologies. Lots of claims about governments causing hurricanes, shifting hurricanes around. I don't have any specific direct proof of it, but I know when you find various governments saying we will control the weather for our national security issues, they're working on it. And but you and I sitting down here looking up really have no way to control or know what they're doing actually. But see, that's the thing is that it feels so big. It feels big, and and when you try to talk to the average person about these kinds of things, I go back to this helpless kind of feeling. Well, what can we do? I just have to pay my bills and put dinner on the table for my family, and my child is sick, and so the reality of their world is so much smaller than the reality of what's really happening in this world. And so I think as we make more people aware of the possibilities and more people educated
on, the technologies, and even the layperson who can understand the terminology without having a degree in physics or necessarily having an ET contact experience, but really can just stay open to the fact that, it makes rational sense that we're not alone in the universe. I mean, it's just a common rational conclusion based on the fact that life expands. And so what the next step that seems to come into all of this is the religious paradigms that have kind of put a cap on that expansion. And I'm curious if we can go into that now. And I'd like both of your insights and thoughts on how religious dogma has really controlled a lot more than most people realize. Jan, let's start with you.
Okay, a lot of religions go back to the basic, it really in their core, love one another. And then the rest is ritual and steps that one takes that are mostly things, prescribed actions. But the basic thing is that, unfortunately, where we've gone with religion is people forget the message, the most important message, and think about just those steps and rituals. As we can see, so many of the wars in the world throughout history, even up until today, are one religion fighting another. Look what's happening now everywhere, really. Religion against religion. I think that's something that we need to if we're looking at the religion part, look at the message, the real message of religion versus the fear that any individuals put out. And I think that's the only way to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Ted, how about you? What are your thoughts?
I was just going to add to Jan's comment, which I agree with, is that it is education of people throughout the world about potentials, possibilities, that there are alternate ways to do things. As we all know, that as a country or a people becomes more and more educated, the birth rate drops, the number of children per woman drops, the quality of food and their improves, et cetera, and that really has to do with it's really tied to education, energy and education. But as people become more and more educated, and one of the things that my sense, and I'm not picking on anybody here, but my sense of thing is that the major religions of the world, at least throughout history, have attempted to keep people uneducated, that there always had to be somebody who was in charge of their spiritual nature or their consciousness, if you will. You always had to go to somebody, pay the priest or the shaman or whoever else to be as interceder for you, when in reality, every human is capable at some level of doing this for themselves. And I think if people start to realize this, they'll realize they don't need an organized religion that sort of keeps them down on the farm, to use a paraphrase of old statement, but they can do things for themselves and think for themselves, and I think that's, again, what education will ultimately do. And the combination of education plus demonstrating to people, back to the energy thing again, demonstrating to people that there are energy technologies available in the world that are being suppressed. Right now, there's, as we mentioned earlier, right now, Stephen Aftergood, the Federation of American Science, just published an article very recently talking about invention secrecy and the fact that there's over 5,000 patents that have been sequestered under the Security Act within the Patent Office and not available. Many of these deal with energy technologies that are just not being allowed to get out to the public. And that's basically a crime against humanity and our planet.
And that article is posted on your website for those that are listening who would like to read that. It's also posted on my Facebook page if you follow me on Facebook and my other social media outlets. Let's go into that for the last section of the show. Who's suppressing it? Why? What's their real agenda? Ted, let's start with you.
Oh, my. Big question.
Yeah. It's an important question. It's an important question.
Oh, absolutely, a very important question. And it really, historically, it goes back to the time of Nikola Tesla, whose inventions and technologies were suppressed. He was prevented from doing some of the things that he wished to do by the major financiers of the time, J.P. Morgan and others, that did not want him to provide inexpensive or free energy to people on this planet through the technologies that he was developing. Remember, those who aren't aware, Nikola Tesla was the one who invented the main current that the whole planet uses for running their households and whatever else. So that's certainly one comment on it. The suppression issue is very complex, and in reality, it has to do it interfaces with the UFO ET issue, which is even more so complex. And it really boils down to power and control. People who run the planet, run the big corporations, want to keep in charge of things. And if everybody had enough energy to live at a cost they could afford, they would lose some of that control. And that has to do with big oil, as well as big electricity and big military aspects. So that's part of the reason. It really has to do with control. And that the UFO issue is kept under wraps because once people realize that the UFOs are real and ETs are real and they aren't coming to this planet using Exxon jet fuel and a little rocket or coal to run their craft, and they have zero-point energy technologies and other very, very advanced technologies, people are going to say, hey, why can't we have these technologies? And then when people learn that these technologies have been around in deep black covert projects for close to a century, people are going to be very mad. And people would like heads to roll because they've basically kept this planet as a third-rate planet, energy speaking, because it's been sequestered and kept under wraps for at least the last 100 years. It's depressing in one way, but it's exciting because we know this now, and the word's getting out. But we need our politicians to, and they're run by different agenda than doing the right thing at times.
And what is that agenda, do you believe?
Getting reelected.
Well,
Jan, what are your thoughts? Jan, what are your thoughts?
Forgive me for interrupting. What I was going to say is we have a $600 trillion derivative economy based on a fossil fuel society. There are those at the top of that who don't want this apple cart upset. So greed and power, as Ted said, are a big problem. And actually, he mentioned J.P. Morgan. I'll paraphrase a quote from J.P. Morgan. When he was approached with one of these devices, he said, "No, I can't put a meter on it, so I don't want it," meaning that he couldn't get money back from it. So I think that statement sums up a lot, and it's time to change. There are those who have been able to continue this through the years, but it is time to change that.
So, Jan, let me ask you this. I mean, it's even whether people, I can see how people in the general population, no matter what their opinion is on ETs, once they hear that free energy technology is available, they may not necessarily believe it comes from reverse engineered alien technology or any of that part of the story, but they would get very upset about the fact that they run around living paycheck to paycheck, trying to make their bills meet, trying to feed their families, put their kids through school, just the basic elements of everyday life and how much they have struggled with trying to do something that they didn't have to struggle with. And I can see that causing quite the uproar all around the planet, even countries that suffer from poverty and mass starvation and diseases, and so the effects are far-reaching and very real to everyday ordinary people's lives. And so that in itself makes this subject worthy of looking into. And then when they see this big, huge elephant sitting in the room of all of these, I call it the corporatocracy. I take that from John Perkins. How are we being farmed into just being good consumers and good buyers and to feed a system that has basically been built up as false? and has just kind of created its own nightmare, if you will?
Yes, I think that's true, and I think a lot of it comes from not stupidity, but ignorance, lack of information that people have. So that's why we exist, to put out the information, the documented information, and give people a chance to at least hear the truth and go from there on the energy issue and the ET issue.
If 1 million people donated $1, it would give you guys $1 million to at least start in the right direction. If 1 million people donated $2, we would at least have $2 million to go into this. What are your hopes on this level of funding projects in a laboratory to really go into? Do you think you would even be allowed to do that at this point, Ted? Or either one of you start?
Do you want me to comment first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, very quickly. We've put together, over the last number of years, we've really analyzed and studied this whole thing, and as a result have put together a proposal, a modest proposal, but the realities of it is we figured it would take about $5 to $6 million to, one, set up a secure laboratory, hire a group, not a large group, but a group of 6 to 10 physicists, scientists, engineers, who would then focus on some of the low-hanging fruit technologies that we're aware of. We've studied literally hundreds of technologies, and we have probably a dozen or so that look very developable, good word, developable over a 1 to 3 year period. That could be commercially level and provide energy technology that would be non-polluting, people off the grid, etc. So we have this proposal, but the reality, you need approximately that level of money to get a building, get facilities, get the equipment necessary to do, and hire people who presently have a real job, to give them a real job and an opportunity for several years, so that leave the present job and work with us. We think we can do this. We've studied the whole thing very carefully. We have a number of people who are very excited and willing to work with us, but they want some sort of security of a couple years' worth of salary. We would set this up in the Charlottesville, Virginia area, which has a very high-end, high-quality university nearby, so we can use the university resources, facilities, and scientists to sort of expand and augment the technologies that we want to develop. That's the level. Now, that's a pretty modest amount when you look at what other monies are spent in this planet, and by municipalities, and what the government spends on various projects that go nowhere.
And if people want to get involved on a volunteer basis, or they don't have that much money to contribute, how do people get involved in helping the cause? Jan?
I can address that. The main thing is, it goes back to what you've been saying all along, Hillary, education and spreading the word. We're a small group of dedicated people doing this for free, every one of us. None of us is paid because we believe in it. As far as what other people can do, the main thing is spreading the information, letting other people know. I think that will help reach a critical mass of educating people. That could help get it funded, perhaps, because people really will understand the truth and then want this. But that's the main thing. We don't have a specific, a lot of little tasks to do, because we, like I say, we don't pay people. But just what you're doing right now, helping us to educate people, is the most critical thing we can do. Anyone can do, and we appreciate that help.
So if you're listening right now and you would...
I'll throw in a comment here as part of our education program. At the present, and this is sort of not publicly known, but I'll mention it here, we are presently putting together a series of ads that we plan to publish in some of the policy magazines in Washington, D.C. area and other areas that policymakers read. And the ads really address this educational issue about that there are alternatives, there is a different way to look at things, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to try to make the policymakers of this country aware of these alternate technologies and that there are alternate ways. And that's something we're literally working on at the present, and hope to be start to put those out sometime with the end of this year, beginning of next year. probably the beginning of next
it's
year.
Good to know that. It's good to know that, because when you both talk about the strides that you're doing in getting this information out to the general public and doing interviews and talking to people across the board, hopefully some of this work and the positive aspects and energy that you both pour into it, Dr. Greer pours into it, and everybody involved pours into it, will hopefully speak to the conscience of some of these bigger policymakers that do really have the power to do something about it, but may not necessarily be doing that for one reason or another. And so the hope is to really, I hope, reach out and touch the hearts of these people and do the right thing. I think it just comes back down to doing the right thing for not only ourselves, but for other people. And the selfishness that's gotten kind of ingrained and entrenched into the consciousness of this fear-based world that we live in, it's really difficult at times to pull out of it, but it's also very simple to pull out of it because it's a choice. It's a choice to do the right thing. Yes. And so, I send you both, a lot of wonderful energy and love and blessings for this work that you're both doing very courageously, I might add, because it's not exactly a welcomed thing in the powers that be fight it, and it's certainly not always a safe thing to be doing. And, for everybody listening, if you want to contribute, whether it's, a few dollars or a few thousand or a few $1,000,000, I mean, go to the website, check it out, talk to Dan. You can contact Dr. Bravo and on the website through the contact part of the website. And you can ask questions and you can become educated in what's really going on. Both my guests today are very, very well articulate in the terminology and the technology that's going on and in the state of the world. And I think that's really, really important for people to understand, is to connect with other people who understand the state of the world that we're really living in, that we're, that are awake and doing this work on big levels and trying to wake other people up. Because this is not science fiction. This is not a fantasy world. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a reality that we're living in that is affecting every one of our lives and will continue to affect our children and grandchildren and generations to come unless we actually make the decision right now to do something about it. And so I want to thank both of you for joining me. And I always ask my guests at the end of the show to give a quick take on what their personal message is for people and what they hope will come from the work that you're doing. Jan, what's your message for people listening right now?
My message is just for people to be open to the fact that things can get better, but everyone has to do something to help it get better. We're doing what we can, and we're glad to answer any questions. And thank you, Hillary, for sharing this message.
And Ted, how about you?
I'll echo what Jan is saying in part, and add back to the education theme. Unless you know that there is a potential for change, you can't even start to make it happen. And that's what one of our jobs as the OrionProject.org is, to make people aware that there is potential for change. There are technologies out there that will help with that change. And once you know it, if you can help us make it happen, we will all be better off as a planet and a people.
And on that note, we are out of time. Thank you, both of you, for joining me. Everyone listening, I'm Hillary Raimo. And until next time, live well. Namaste.